Why I don't care about my window manager. What's going on, everybody? In this video, we're going to do a bit of a fun topic for a change. It won't be as technical, but we will be covering a bit around scripting and different things like that. What I'm hoping to cover in this session is a bit around my perspective around why window managers aren't that important for me. Now, I'm a massive fan of window managers. One of the things I love about Linux is you can choose these different window managers with varying styles. I've spent a long amount of time on everything from DWM to KDE and everything in between. And what I found over time of trying to optimize and get my window manager strategy better and better is that there's just a couple core principles for me that actually make my workflow the fastest. And those principles happen to be independent of which window manager I'm using. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, first thing we're going to cover is window managers themselves. I'm going to give just a brief overview of the different types. Many of you coming into this video are probably quite familiar with that. Then we're going to go over to priorities. And these are the things that, again, I said over time I've learned I hold as the most valuable in being productive and enjoying my desktop experience. I'm going to be covering a topic that I call launch or focus, which is one of the implementations of those principles. And then finally, I'll be showing how I bring all these together with shortcuts or key bindings, which are really the key thing for me as a Linux user. So with that, let's get right into it, starting off with window managers. So I think the ArchWiki honestly does an awesome job of describing the categories. They have a list of window managers, and the three categories are stacking, tiling, and dynamic. Stacking are the KDEs, the gnomes, the XFCEs, the managers where you expect to have windows that sort of stack on top of each other. In fact, that's what I've got right here, where I can have a multitude of windows. They can overlay each other, and it's pretty free form as far as how I set them up in my environment, which is great. Now, the other side of the spectrum includes tiling window managers. And tiling window managers are things like DWM, i3. These allow you to basically set up different workspaces that you can switch between and then kind of tile the windows as they open. In fact, I brought up an example here from a Wikipedia image on i3. In the bottom left, you can see this person is in workspace 9. Typically, they'll have 1 through 9. And they can effectively choose, or maybe even 0 through 9, depending on how it's set up. And basically, they can choose workspace 1, 2, 3, 4. And when they have one of these workspaces open, like this person has number 9, as they open browser windows, terminals, you can see how they slice side by side. And this, for a lot of folks, gives them a really good way of seeing what is going on at any given time. I think a lot of folks have got really great workflows around tiling window managers where they just can't see themselves going back. And I've used tiling window managers for a couple years. Probably the one I've used longest term was DWM. And it was awesome. I would say the one thing I learned as I get a little bit more into the principles side of things is that I would spend a lot more time kind of optimizing and tuning my window manager. And I don't think I was really seeing the gains of using a tiling window manager. In fact, as you'll learn, I went back to using a stacked manager when I rethought through some of my processes. So with all that being said, and I guess I should mention too, that third category, which they call dynamic, is mostly referring to those window managers that can do both. Things like Awesome that are super configurable. Honestly, a lot of these you can do both. Like DWM, in fact, DWM is listed right here. It's very easy to switch between different modes of stacked and tiled and so on. And frankly, like a lot of window managers let you shoot windows to different sides, which you can get a tiling-like experience. I know it's not pure tiling in all those cases, but it's close enough in a lot of ways. So nonetheless, the key categories are tiling and stacked. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit about what my priorities or principles are around window managers themselves. So it might seem a little weird that I'm saying I don't really care about my window manager, but then talking about like pros and cons I've found in them, right? And specifically, when I think of window management, there's a couple key things that come into mind, and that is what tools I use regularly. So in any given day, if it's work, if it's personal, if it's anything, typically what I'm doing is I'm using a web browser, okay? And in my case, this is oftentimes Firefox. I'm typically using a terminal slash, let's just call it like a text editor to keep it generic. And this for me is ST or simple terminal. And the editor is Vim, which would obviously run out of ST. And love it or hate it, some purists aren't fans of using these things, but I like having an IDE around if I have to hop in some Java code or even do some more advanced Go code in a larger package or library. I like having an IDE, and maybe to add insult to injury here, I like using IntelliJ, which is a Java-based IDE. But for me, it's great. I like it a lot. And if you don't, that's cool. And then the last thing that I like to use is a directory browser, or maybe let's just call it a file browser, I guess is maybe a more canonical way to put it. And I use something called Nemo. Now, I rarely go into my file browser because I can just CP and MV stuff around using the terminal. But rather than having like an ncurses based, text slash sort of GUI thing in my terminal for file browsing, if I want to do file browsing, I just open up Nemo. It's good. It's adequate. I don't really have the desire to learn something that keeps me in my terminal for the sake of file browsing. So these are the tools that I am most commonly switching between. And sure, there's variants. Like right now I'm using OBS, and that's not in this list. But I don't use OBS enough to call it one of my primary tools. Now, what are my priorities when using Linux and using, actually independent of Linux, any operating system? Well, the key things are I want to be able to easily switch to, let's call them core apps. And then I also want to do so, and I'll make this a sub-bullet, with least amount of context switching. All right, so what do I mean by least amount of context switching? Now, if I have a stacked manager or a tiled manager and I'm in my terminal, or let's say maybe in my IDE, I'm writing some code and I need to go to my terminal to compile it, or maybe I need to go to my web browser to look up some documentation. How do I get there? Well, maybe first off, I have to launch the app, which would require me to use something like dmenu, type in the application I'm trying to launch, and then fire it off, which is okay. Or maybe I have some kind of Alt-Tab like configuration where I can cycle through the windows that I have open. That's another option. And there's many different ways. Like I could launch from my terminal. I could, in the case of a tiling manager, probably have a different workspace that I dedicate to web browser stuff. But at the end of the day, I'm trying to minimize the amount of things to think about between going from app A to app B when my goal is to get some kind of task done. And that might seem crazy and like overly pedantic, and that's okay. But for me, the minimal amount of context switching I can have between those switches is actually what makes my desktop experience the most ideal and actually makes me most effective. And again, this is probably something that might not apply to you, and that's cool, but at least from my perspective, that's what I prioritize. So how do I do this? Well, the key thing that I want to get across with my window managers is effectively being able to go to any one of these apps. And if I'm currently in one, I want to be able to switch to this one. So let's say tilde star is the one I want to switch to. And ideally what I want to do is focus the window or launch if not running. Right? That's kind of like my ideal goal state here when I'm kind of switching between things. So this is where the concept of launching or focusing comes in for me when I'm doing different things in my desktop. So let's transition over and talk a bit about what the launch or focus mechanism is. Now, there is, if we go to the browser for a moment, there are actually a couple options that you have here when you're kind of looking for this type of functionality. There's one, I believe it's called like Jump App. Let's see if I can find it on GitHub here. Yeah, Jump App. So Jump App is a far more elegant project around this concept of run or raise applications. If you're looking for something that's more formal and fancy, this is probably the way to go and not the way that I'm about to show you. But Jump App aside, well, actually, just to focus on Jump App for a second, the only reason I don't use Jump App, there's nothing wrong with it. I'm sure it's a freaking great tool. The only reason I don't use it is it's got a lot going on and it's hard for me to understand what's going on just by looking at the shell script. That's all. Nothing more than that. So I've opted to write something, a little script that I use constantly that is really easy for me to understand and gets me to 97% of my use cases. So what is that alternative that I've built in I use? Well, this is actually a file I keep in my Linux desktop repo. I have a blog post on the Linux desktop repo and how I use it to provision my machine when I reinstall my OS and all that good stuff. I'll put a link to this GitHub repo too if you want to check it out. But long story short, this is just some automation to set up my desktop. In the S package, I have common scripts, and I don't have many, basically LOF and LOF IntelliJ. So I'll open up LOF or Launcher Focus. Now, as far as LOF is concerned, if we look at it here, and hypothetically, if we took out some of the comments at the beginning, right? So it's roughly 19 lines minus probably 4 to 8 more based on all these extra comments, right? So getting this done is really as simple as writing 20 or so lines of shell script that I can call. So let me walk you through what this does, and maybe it'll give you some ideas. The first thing it does, like a lot of shell scripts, is it just takes the first argument in, and it's a single argument script. It's not elegant. If you add extra arguments, it doesn't do checking and validation. So it's very much like on you to use it correctly because it's an internal tool for me, right? But the key thing is that we use the app name. So the idea here is if I go to a terminal for a moment and I have LOF in my path, if I were to say something like LOF, all right, and the idea would be, can I call an application like Firefox with LOF? Now, this actually does bring up Firefox, right? But one thing it actually did, if you didn't notice, is it brought up a new instance of Firefox because I had this instance of Firefox running from before. And my ideal scenario with Launcher Focus is in this case to focus instead of launching. So what do I do here? So the key thing when you're looking at kind of like focusing, and this is cool for just general Linux automation, when you're looking to focus an application, is understanding how you can resolve the window ID. There's a couple ways that you can do this. Sometimes you can do it just by the title of the window. So you can actually see here, this is called Window Manager, ArchWiki, so on and so forth. But the one downside to that approach is many applications rewrite their window title based on the context of where the app is. So if I change my tab, the window title changes, right? And I would expect this if I change the website to have pretty similar behavior overall. Now, what I find to be a little bit of a more consistent and easy to reason with experience is to basically resolve the window ID via the process ID, which might sound a little complicated, but it's actually not too bad. So here's the idea. We can use a tool called pgrep, which is process grep. If we add the -f flag in, it's going to basically allow us to search via a regular expression that is going to look over the entire line that the PS command would be aware of. So think of this like if you had extra arguments or extra things in that you wanted to resolve specifically against, this would enable you to do that. So if you're having a hard time conceptualizing this, think of it this way. There is a tool that you can download for Linux. Some distros might even have it. It's called Window Manager Control or WM Control. And in here, you can list the windows in their processes. Now, let's take, for example, Firefox. So inside of Firefox, a moment ago, I remember that the title of that window was Window Manager, ArchWiki, Mozilla Firefox. The process that owns this window is 1183. And you can see the window ID is actually to the left of that. That's going to be sort of important for us later, okay? So if I go in and I do a PS and I put in the process ID, now I can see what the full command is when I use Firefox on my machine. Now, if I ran Firefox in a special way and put in special command line arguments or flags, it would break what I'm about to do. But I don't do that, which makes this work perfectly for me. So the idea with launch or focus is as long as I grab the full command that would own the window and I do launch or focus this, it will bring up Firefox just like that, right? And if I were to completely close out of Firefox altogether and run this again, it will launch me a brand new window of Firefox 2, which is exactly what I would want. So if I go back to Arch, get back to the website here. Okay, so we're here. Let's say I open up a new tab just to make it a little bit custom, right? So now we've got 2 tabs open here. And if I go back to launcher focus, just to kind of bring, oh, you know what I should have done is put an ampersand here. So let's go back, and it did actually reopen Firefox that time. But here, we'll do one more thing just to make it clear. If I do click on how to install Arch Linux, okay, now we've got this. I'll go back to my terminal, and now if I do it, it brings it back to focus, right? So basically, as long as I've got that fully qualified command in, I can use this against any application that I'm interested in bringing up. And it, again, is using that concept of resolving the window ID based on the process itself. So to try to bring that full circle, coming back to the script, we've got the app PID, and we're going to run this command, if you will, right, inside of here and store the result in the PID. Now, if pgrep comes up with nothing, the value in app PID will be blank. This is the case where Firefox, for example, is not running. So then we've got an if statement inside of here that says, if this is empty, then go ahead and just run the app name, which, since we know the app name was the location to run Firefox, it's just going to run Firefox, just like that. In the else case, which we would assume there was some PID, and again, I don't do any validation for like the PID's validity or anything, but if a value gets set here, we assume pgrep found a PID, in which case, instead of launching the app, we want to figure out what the window ID is, right? So how would we resolve the window ID? Well, you can probably kind of reverse engineer this at this point without even looking at the script. If we came back to our output, so let's do wmctrl, and we did lp here, we can see the window IDs side by side with the processes. We know unquestionably that this Mozilla Firefox thing here is the PID, so 5276. So if we did this and we grepped for 5276, we'd narrow ourselves down to that single line. Now, what we really care about is the first column, the window ID. So there's a bunch of ways we can do this, but one of the common ways in Linux is awk, which has this really commonly used command, which will be print, and then the variable 1, which will give us the result of the first column. So now we have the window ID that would be focused based on the PID we resolved. Now, if we go back to the code editor, you can see the final command that gets run against wid, which would be this right here. So window manager control, the R brings it into focus in the desktop that you're currently in. So if you use a multi-desktop window manager, just know that that does happen. But that's it. So in just a couple lines, I'm able to solve, and anyone is able to solve, this kind of notion of launching or focusing something. Now, again, I had mentioned that it's not as elegant as some solutions like Jump App, and I do keep this script pretty simple intentionally. Like a great example is I had mentioned I use IntelliJ, which is the editor you're seeing right here, to do a lot of my bigger projects. And IntelliJ is a Java-based process that's a little bit more complex because you run a command, it has a wrapper around it that launches a instance of JRE that then runs IntelliJ. Okay, so, you know, it's just one of those things. It's a little more complicated, but genuinely, this is the only application I run that's like this, at least that I'm aware of. I don't have any other application that has this type of flow to it. So rather than making this script more complex, what I opted to do, and this is just a matter of taking a trade-off, right, is make a specific script for IntelliJ. That way I could keep LOF really general purpose. And basically the biggest difference between the LOF for IntelliJ and my general purpose LOF is that it calls out the explicit app name, and then it calls out the explicit process path that would resolve in PS. And you can see the pgrep is actually a little different here. I'm not using the caret and $ in the regular expression for reasons. And it basically does the same if statement. The big difference here is if it does not find the PID, it launches the app name based on this up here, right? Now, if you pause for a moment, there's a million and one ways I could solve this differently. I could absolutely make the LOF app handle this scenario, or I shouldn't even call it an app, the LOF script, but I don't want to. I want to keep it dead simple, and should exceptions like this arise, I'd rather just have copy and pasted code that is more specific for this app. And that's, again, one of those trade-offs you have to think about. So overall, this is pretty much it. I've got the ability to focus and all that good stuff. Now, we've got the focus in place, but if I was actually coming in here running LOF like this constantly, you'd probably be saying, well, Josh, that's pretty stupid. You're coming into your terminal to run LOF like you just were complaining about context switching, so on and so forth. So to bring this idea full circle, the last thing that I've got to set up are key bindings around this idea of LOF, all right? So now we're going to transition into the shortcuts themselves. Now, there are a lot of different ways to do shortcuts, and there's a lot of great tutorials out there on how to do them. Really quick, I will tell you that I use a command called xbindkeys. And if you spell it right, it would certainly show up inside of your result here. And I should mention RG is just an alternative to grep, but you could use grep here to resolve the same. So I run a process called xbindkeys. Now, xbindkeys, let's just bring up the man pages here. Xbindkeys is a program that can take events from the keyboard and even the mouse and do things, do commands, okay? So why do I use xbindkeys? The reason is because xbindkeys is an agent or a daemon that can run and capture these events independent of the window manager I use. So if I wake up tomorrow and I say, wow, that video I made about not caring about my window manager, that was a lie. And I really want to use i3 all of a sudden. The things I set up in xbindkeys will translate to i3. It is completely independent of the window manager I'm using. And because of that general purpose nature, I really like using it. And it keeps things pretty darn simple. Now, the P that you saw when I ran it, that is a command for poll, which I don't know if it's in the man pages that I was just in. So let's do help. The P polls the RC file, and this is quite important. I've had a lot of folks that I've been playing around with Linux stuff in the past who change their xbindkeys and go, why the heck won't this key get registered? And it's because they're not polling for their RC changes. And as far as when I run xbindkeys is something that I put in my xinit RC. So I got to fix that Vim error there, where basically if you're using a X window manager, many of you probably use start X to start the window manager. This xinit RC file are the commands that you're going to run when you're going to initiate your window manager. So before I start xfce4, I would call this command. And this is actually the file I changed. So if I am feeling like using DWM one morning for any reason, I just change this to DWM. And then DWM will launch and xbindkeys will still register. And then things like the menu you see up here, which is D menu, will still work in either of those contexts. So that is xinit RC. Now, let's talk about the RC file for xbindkeys. If we go into xbindkeys RC, which the default location is simply in your home folder. Many people believe you should put this in a .config folder, but that's your preference as well. Okay, this is what the configuration looks like. And setting this up, there are some graphical interfaces, but honestly, once you get it down from a command line perspective, it's actually pretty darn easy. So let's go through a use case with LOF just to show you how simple it is to link this thing together. So as an example, I'm going to bring up an application called Blueman Manager. Now, this is a tool that I use to graphically manage my Bluetooth devices when I'm feeling lazy and don't want to use Bluetooth CTL. So what if this is something I very commonly use and I want to set up a keyboard shortcut to shift through it or to, again, launch or focus? Well, first thing I would do is I'm going to open up a separate window here and I want to figure out what is the key names, that's these right here, for the new keystroke I want to use, okay? So the really easy way to do this with xbindkeys is to type in xbindkeys-k. It opens up this little window that you can see here above my head. And now we just have to press a key. So for Bluetooth, let's say Command or Windows key E, okay, arbitrarily. So we'll hit that. And then it will say, okay, so you chose mod 4E, here's the code above it, and here's the scheme function that you'll want to put in. And if I just copy this in place, I can then go back up to my settings up here. Oops, wrong buffer. Okay. And I will paste it in. We will call it launch Blueman Manager. Okay. And now we're pretty much set up and good to go. So I will exit out of here and I will set up the command itself. So as you can see here, this is what the Firefox command looked like. So if I just bring that up, and then all I need to do here is now figure out what is the exact path that's being set, or I guess called against, to run Blueman. Because as I told you, the way I've got LOF implemented, it expects those hyper-specific full command line, arguments and strings. So how can I do this? Well, we talked a bit about it. If we do window manager control and list the windows that are open, I can clearly see the Bluetooth devices are here. So the process ID is clearly 6380. Let's do the PS command and put that in. And as you can see in the command column, this is my command for Blue Manager. You can see my head's kind of blocking it here, but you get the idea. So we'll grab the command, and then let's go back to our setup here, and let's put that in place. So I'll paste that in. Now, you might remember that the script is set up in such a way that it does not expect there to be any kind of second argument, right? So it brings in the first argument and it does this grep command, pgrep command. So what this means is we cannot have this space in here. We need to break this space such that it treats it as one argument where space is actually a character. So I'll save this file. Now, Xbind keys should be polling. So in theory, hitting Windows key or mod key or Command E should bring up my Bluetooth window. And if I hit it, there's my Bluetooth window. And if I were to go up here and close it out so that it's actually exited, and I hit it again, there's the Bluetooth window once again. So now I can easily cycle through my Bluetooth window, my terminal. I can go to my editor. I can bring up my web browser, all of that good stuff. And I've got multiple other apps that I, again, have commands for that I commonly like to bring up. So all in all, that's about it. It's really just a matter of, kind of figuring out what your priorities are. And I think the biggest nuanced thing about this particular video that I wanted to call out here is that it's super cool to try out different window managers and use them. And perhaps there is a window manager that makes your life so much better. As far as window managers for me go, the only criteria that I would say I care a decent amount about is that they have somewhat low utilization. Now, you might call me a bit of a hypocrite because if I look at my window manager here, this is certainly way more process intensive. Let's see if I can bring this down a bit. This is way more process intensive than, say, an instance of DWM would be. But overall, and of course, I can't. Oh, there it is. Yep. So you can see at this point, 4.6 CPU, 5.9 CPU, 0.3 memory usage. So it is more intense, and I could use a more minimal manager, but this isn't as bad as KDE or even GNOME or something crazy. So I just try to find something that's decently minimal, right? Gives me conveniences that I do like to have. And then once I've got those priorities aligned, the, again, nuance of this particular session is more so that for me, it doesn't even matter. Aside from just some small things, I can use pretty much any window manager. My workflow does not change drastically. And just over time, I've learned, as much as I want to be super passionate about DWM or super passionate about i3 or awesome window manager, it doesn't end up making that big of a difference for me. So I'll end it there. I hope this gave you some interesting perspective. Maybe you found the LOF thing interesting as well. It was a bit of a different type of video and content. I'd love to know what you think about this type of content. So feel free to leave a comment on this video, and I'd love to hear from you and get an idea if this is stuff that interests you a bit. But I'll probably be back to more technical, videos around Linux or Kubernetes or containers pretty soon here. Thanks for watching. I'll have a link to my blog post as well in the description if you want to see some of the text samples that you saw in here. And until next time, see you then.